Understanding how to read and use the histogram can make a big difference in the consistency and the quality of your exposure, both in the field and later in post-production. Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the next episode in my series of essential landscape photography skills. Now it's hard for me to get this around my head, but this is actually the 20th episode in this series and I'm almost finished now in putting all of these topics into my next free ebook. It's going to be called Essential Landscape Photography Skills 2. And if you want to get your copy, then be sure to join my newsletter. There'll be a link in the description below. Now, my name is Darren. I'm a passionate landscape photographer and I'm based here in beautiful Ireland. And on this channel, I take you on some amazing adventures to some of Ireland's most beautiful locations. So if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and join me on these exciting journeys. Now, for my 20th episode, I want to walk you through a tool that honestly I think every landscape photographer should be more than comfortable with, and that is the histogram. Now, it doesn't matter if you're just starting out or you've been shooting for years, understanding how to read and use the histogram can make a big difference in the consistency and the quality of your exposure, both in the field and later in post-production. So let's take a closer look. So to begin, let's start exactly by explaining what is a histogram. So in simple terms, it's a graph that shows the tonal values of your image. So you've got black on the far left, and then you've got white on the far right. And everything in between are different shades of grey. Now the height of the graph at any point shows how many pixels fall into that brightness of that level. Now this might sound technical, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes second nature. And it's a much more reliable way to judge exposure than just looking at the back of your camera screen, especially if you're in bright or low light conditions. Most modern cameras offer a couple of types of histogram. So the main one is your luminance histogram, and this gives you an overview of the brightness across your image. And that's the one generally that I use when I'm out shooting. But then you also have your RGB histogram, which is your red, your green and your blue. So this breaks it down into the three different colors, red, green and blue channels. And it's useful if you're dealing with skies that have intense colors. So for example, like sunrises or sunsets, because it helps you to see if any of the individual colors on the channels are being clipped. So it's worth checking to see if your camera allows that, especially when color accuracy really matters. Reading the histogram, it isn't really complicated once you know what to look out for. So start with the edges. So if the graph is spiking hard on the left-hand side, this usually means that your shadows are clipped or underexposed. And if you're using details on the dark areas, that means that you need to increase your exposure. If it's spiking on the right side, then you've probably blown the highlights, so you've overexposed. The middle of the graph, these are your midtones, and this is where the bulk of a well-exposed image will often sit. Now, of course, that depends on the scene. You're looking for a distribution that makes sense for the lighting conditions that you're shooting in. So if there's big gaps in your histogram, especially on either end, then that can be a sign that you're not making full use of your sensor's full dynamic range. When I'm out shooting, especially in fast-changing light, I always look at my histogram, especially after taking a shot. It helps me to double-check the exposure without second-guessing what I'm seeing on the back of the LCD. Now, if the histogram is pushed far to the left, then of course I'll bump up my exposure slightly. If it's too far to the right, then of course I pull it back. Now, the goal isn't always to have a perfectly centered histogram. Some scenes, they suit a darker or brighter exposure, but you do want to make sure that you're not throwing away detail that you might need later. This habit of checking the histogram, it becomes second nature pretty quickly, and it can save you from coming home with underexposed or overexposed images, especially when the light isn't really obvious to the eye. Now, when the histogram shows that your image is too dark or too bright, you've got a couple of really solid tools that can help you fix that in the field. So exposure compensation is the quickest fix, so just nudge it up or down and take another shot. Use this especially when shooting in aperture priority mode, but you should really be shooting in manual mode. There's also exposure bracketing, which I also use when I'm dealing with high contrast scenes, like a bright sky or an over dark foreground. So I'll take a few exposures, one for the highlights, one for the shadows, and one in the middle, and then I'll blend them together to create a good final image that captures the full tonal range. But if I'm being totally honest here, the middle exposure image is generally the one I end up using. So keep that in mind. Now histograms, they don't just matter in the field, they're equally useful when it gets to editing. In Lightroom or Photoshop, the histogram helps guide your adjustments. If your highlights are pushing too far to the right when you increase the exposure or contrast, then you'll see it immediately. The same goes for crushing the shadows. Now I use the histogram here to fine-tune the image, making sure that I'm not clipping any of the key details, and while still getting the look that I want to have. I have some videos here on YouTube showing my approach to editing, and these series are called Behind the Raw, where you can see this approach in action. I'll put a link up here to the playlist. Now, there's a few things to watch out for when you're shooting in the field. First and foremost, don't ignore the histogram. It's easy to just rely on your camera's LCD screen, but that's often misleading, especially in harsh light. Secondly, don't misread the histogram. So a centered graph doesn't automatically mean your image is well exposed. So for example, a moody shot of a forest in deep shade will naturally have a histogram skewed towards the shadows. And that's perfectly fine. It all depends on the scene and the story you're trying to tell with your image. Your histogram can also get confused. For example, if the majority of the scene is dark, then it will think that it's exposed well for exactly that. But watch those highlights. Now, turning on highlight priority and playback can really help you here, and it's certainly helped me so far. The histogram is one of those things that might feel technical at first, but it's genuinely a really helpful tool that will make you a more consistent photographer over time. It helps you to avoid guesswork. It gives you much better control over your exposure settings. So I would advise you to use it often. If this video helped clarify things, then please consider hitting that like button, and also consider hitting subscribe button if you haven't already. And I'd love to hear how you use the histogram in your own workflow. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Now, before we wrap up, I want to take a moment to thank my incredible Patreon supporters. Because of all your support, it makes all of this possible. Now, whether it's helping me to get out to make more locations or dedicating the time to share these types of lessons, I couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to join this amazing growing community, gain exclusive content, early access to videos, and even get discounts on my guidebooks and my workshops, I'd love for you to consider joining me as a Patreon. Just scan the QR code right here, and I'd love to have you on board. Thanks as always for watching, and hopefully I'm lucky enough to see you on the next one. Slán go fóill.